It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to slow down, and the only sounds you hear are the distant hum of the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling. I was home alone, as I often was, and had just finished dinner. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the living room lamp, and I was curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the solitude. But as the night deepened, something felt. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the air had grown heavier, more oppressive. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I was alone in a big house, and it was easy to let your mind wander when the silence was so absolute. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from upstairs. It was soft, like the rustling of fabric, or the gentle scrape of something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my book forgotten in my lap. I listened intently, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to investigate or just lock myself in my room and wait until morning. But curiosity, or perhaps a morbid sense of duty, got the better of me. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath me, and made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. I paused at the top of the stairs, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and listened again. The sound was coming from the far end of the hallway, near the guest bedroom. I crept down the hallway, my hand brushing against the wall for support, and stopped outside the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it, and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the empty room. Or at least it should have been empty, but it wasn't. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me, and it was moving, slowly, deliberately, like it was searching for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. Who or what was in my house, and how had they gotten in? Before I could react, the figure straightened up and turned to face me. I couldn't make out its features in the dim light, but I could see its eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and ran, my feet slamming against the floor as I bolted down the hallway and back down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was in the living room, my back pressed against the wall, my chest heaving. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. The operator's voice was calm and reassuring, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own panic. I told her what had happened, my voice shaking, and she assured me that help was on the way. I stayed on the line, my eyes glued to the staircase, waiting for the figure to appear. But it never did. The police arrived within minutes, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched their house. They found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. The guest bedroom was empty, just as it should have been. The officers were kind, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They suggested that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that the stress of being alone had gotten to me. I wanted to believe them, but I knew what I had seen. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, too terrified to go back home. The next day, I returned with a locksmith to change all the locks and install a security system. I told myself that it was just a one-time thing, that I had nothing to worry about. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still in the house, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The house was quiet, too quiet. I was 10 years old, and it was the first time my parents had left me home alone overnight. They had gone to visit my aunt in the next town over, and since it was a school night, they decided it was best for me to stay behind. I remember feeling a strange mix of pride and unease as I watched their car disappear down the street. The house felt different without them, bigger somehow, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. I spent the first few hours after they left doing all the things I wasn't supposed to do when they were home. I ate ice cream straight from the container, stayed up past my bedtime and watched a scary movie on TV. It was one of those old black and white films with creaky doors and flickering lights. I thought it was funny at first, but as the night wore on, the laughter faded and the silence of the house began to press in on me. It was around midnight when I first heard the noise. I was lying on the couch, half asleep, the TV now playing static because the movie had ended hours ago. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the way old houses do, but then it came again, a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on glass. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window, but the kitchen window didn't have any trees near it. I grabbed the flashlight my dad kept by the couch and crept toward the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The tapping grew louder as I approached, and I could feel my breath quicken. I stopped just outside the kitchen door, my hand trembling as I reached for the light switch. The fluorescent light flickered on, and I blinked against the sudden brightness. The kitchen was empty, just as I had left it. The dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, and the clock on the wall ticked softly. But the tapping was still there, clear and distinct. It was coming from the window above the sink. I stepped closer, my reflection in the dark glass staring back at me. The tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but the sound didn't return. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly for being so scared. It was just the wind, I told myself, or maybe a bird. I turned off the light and went back to the couch, pulling the blanket tightly around me. But sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, and then I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was faster, more insistent. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't want to go back to the kitchen, but I couldn't just lie there and do nothing. I grabbed the flashlight again, and forced myself to my feet. The tapping grew louder as I approached the kitchen, and this time I didn't stop at the door. I walked straight to the window and shone the flashlight through the glass. At first I saw nothing but my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. But then something moved, just outside the beam of light. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. And then I saw it. A face. It was pressed against the glass, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and let out a scream that echoed through the empty house. The face disappeared, and I heard the sound of footsteps running across the porch. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the front door, locking it with shaking hands. I checked every window, every door, making sure they were all locked. Then I grabbed the phone and dialed my parents' number, but the line was dead. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The tapping didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains made me jump. I kept my eyes fixed on the kitchen door, waiting for something to come through. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I could breathe again. I called my parents, and they came home as soon as they could. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just a nightmare, that I had let my imagination run wild. But I knew what I had seen, and even now, years later, I can still see that face in my mind, pale and haunting, staring at me through the kitchen window. I never stayed home alone again after that night, and to this day, I can't look at a dark window without feeling a chill run down my spine. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was driving back home after visiting my parents in the countryside. The roads were slick with rain, and the fog was so thick that my headlights barely cut through it. I had been on the road for hours, and my GPS had taken me down a series of back roads that seemed to stretch on forever. My phone signal was spotty at best, and I was starting to feel a sense of unease as the trees closed in around me. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of my windshield wipers and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I was about an hour away from home when my car suddenly sputtered and died. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered, and then everything went dark. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, as the reality of the situation set in. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea where the nearest town was. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was howling through the trees. I knew I couldn't stay in the car all night. It was too cold, and I was already starting to shiver. I grabbed my phone and my jacket, hoping I might find a signal if I walked a bit. I stepped out into the rain, the cold immediately biting through my clothes. The road was deserted, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. I walked for what felt like forever, my shoes squelching in the mud, until I finally saw a faint glow through the trees. It was a house, or at least what looked like a house. It was old, with a sagging roof and peeling paint, but there was a light on in one of the windows. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of spending the night in the cold was enough to push me forward. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling from the cold. There was no answer at first, but then I heard footsteps creaking on the other side. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly man with a hunched back and a face lined with deep wrinkles. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with watery eyes. I explained my situation, my voice shaking, and asked if I could use his phone or stay the night. He nodded slowly and stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. The inside of the house was just as old and decrepit as the outside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, and the walls were covered in faded wallpaper that was peeling at the edges. The man led me to a small sitting room, where a fire was crackling in the hearth. He pointed to an old rotary phone on a side table, and then shuffled off into another room without a word. I picked up the phone, but the line was dead. I tried not to panic. Maybe the storm had knocked out the lines. I sat down by the fire, trying to warm up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man returned a few minutes later with a cup of tea. He handed it to me without a word, and then sat down in a chair across the room, staring into the fire. I sipped the tea, which was surprisingly good, and tried to make small talk. But the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the fire, his face expressionless. I started to feel uneasy again, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, he had let me in and given me tea. What harm could he do? As the night wore on, I started to notice strange things. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. The man never spoke, and he never took his eyes off the fire. I tried to distract myself by looking around the room, but my eyes kept being drawn to a large portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was of a young woman, her face pale, and her eyes dark and haunting. There was something unsettling about the way she seemed to be staring right at me. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I opened my eyes and saw the man standing over me, his face inches from mine. I gasped and jerked back, but he didn't move. He just stared at me with those watery eyes, his expression unreadable. Then without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice behind me. It was soft and whispery, and it sent a chill down my spine. I turned around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, except for the man, who was still sitting in his chair by the fire. I opened the door and stepped outside, the rain soaking me instantly. I didn't look back as I ran down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I eventually found a gas station a few miles away, where I was able to call for help. When I told the attendant about the house, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been anyone living in that area for years. I didn't argue with him. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house, and I can't help but wonder who, or what was watching me from the shadows. It was a chilly autumn evening when my parents decided to take a much-needed vacation, leaving me home alone for the first time. I was 17, and while I was excited about the freedom, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest as I watched their car disappear down the driveway. The house felt different without them, larger, emptier, and somehow more alive with the creaks and groans of its old bones. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something felt off. The first night was uneventful. I ordered pizza, watched a movie, and stayed up late playing video games. By the time I went to bed, the house was quiet, and I fell asleep almost instantly. But the second night was different. That's when the strange things started happening. It began with the sound of footsteps. I was in the kitchen, making myself a late-night snack, when I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping coming from the living room. At first I thought it was the wind rattling the windows or the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I convinced myself I was just hearing things. But then they started again, this time moving closer to the kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the counter and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice trembled, and I hated how scared I sounded. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps retreating back into the living room. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my knuckles white around the knife handle, before I finally worked up the courage to investigate. The living room was empty, the TV off, and the curtains still. Everything looked normal, but the air felt heavy, like someone had been there just moments before. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one, and went back to my room. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I slept with the lights on that night, jumping at every little noise. The next day, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I kept busy, cleaning the house and texting my friends to distract myself. But as the sun set and the house grew dark, the unease returned. I decided to stay in my room, locking the door and keeping the TV on for background noise. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming from the hallway outside my room. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the door. The footsteps stopped right outside, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, ready to call the police. But then the doorknob began to turn. It rattled softly, as if someone was testing it, and then it stopped. I waited, too terrified to move, until I heard the footsteps retreating down the hallway. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, clutching a baseball bat, and listened to every sound the house made. The wind outside, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. It all seemed louder, more menacing. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I started in the basement, the one place in the house I rarely went. It was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I turned on the light and began searching, my heart pounding with every step. That's when I found it. A small hidden door tucked behind the furnace. It was barely noticeable, the wood blending in with the wall, but the handle was cold and metallic, like it had been used recently. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, before I finally pulled it open. The door creaked loudly, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. My stomach churned as I stared into the abyss, but I knew I had to see where it led. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The staircase led to a small hidden room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old books, photographs, and strange trinkets. But what caught my attention was the chair in the center of the room. It was an old wooden chair, the kind you'd see in a vintage photograph, and it was facing the wall. My blood ran cold as I realized there was someone sitting in it. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, as the figure slowly turned to face me. It was an old man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He smiled at me, a crooked, unsettling smile, and whispered, "I've been waiting for you." I screamed and bolted back up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut behind me. I ran to my room, locked the door, and called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything, but when they searched the basement, the hidden door was gone. The wall was solid, with no trace of a door or a staircase. They told me it was just my imagination, that I must have been dreaming, but I knew what I saw. I stayed with a friend for the rest of the week, too scared to go back home. When my parents returned, I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me either. They said the house was old, that it was just settling, and that I must have been stressed from being alone. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in that house. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone is still there, waiting for me to come back. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps. It was a quiet Friday night, and I had just gotten home from work. My girlfriend Sarah had left earlier that afternoon to visit her parents for the weekend. She had been planning the trip for weeks, and I was happy for her to get some time away. But as I walked into our small, cozy house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the living room curtains. I flipped on the lights, and the familiar warmth of our home greeted me, but there was an eerie stillness in the air that I couldn't quite place. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors settling. I sat down on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to relax after a long day, but as the minutes ticked by, I started to notice little things that didn't add up. The front door, which I was sure I had locked behind me, was slightly ajar. I got up to check it, and sure enough, the deadbolt wasn't engaged. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had forgotten to lock it in my tired state. But as I turned the lock, I felt a chill run down my spine. I went back to the couch, trying to shake the unease that was creeping over me. I turned on the TV, hoping the noise would distract me, but the silence of the house seemed to swallow the sound. I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting someone to walk in. The rational part of my brain told me I was being paranoid, but the other part couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head upstairs to bed. I turned off the TV and the lights, leaving only the dim glow of the nightlight in the hallway to guide me. As I climbed the stairs, I heard a faint noise coming from the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. It was a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The spare room was always kept closed, and Sarah and I rarely went in there. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate to ignore. I slowly walked down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The tapping continued, growing louder as I approached the door. I reached out to turn the doorknob, but before I could, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise itself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the knob, debating whether to open the door or just go back to bed. Finally, I mustered the courage and turned the knob, pushing the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I fumbled for the light switch, and when I flipped it on, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched, and the closet door closed. I let out a sigh of relief, chiding myself for being so jumpy. I turned off the light and closed the door, deciding to leave it locked this time. Back in my bedroom, I climbed into bed, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. The tapping didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a new sound, a faint scratching coming from the closet in my room. My eyes snapped open, and I stared at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get out. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I told myself it was just a mouse or some other small animal that had found its way into the house. But as I listened, the scratching turned into a low guttural growl. My blood ran cold. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hands trembling as I dialed 911, but before I could hit the call button, the closet door creaked open, and a pair of glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. I froze, unable to move or scream. The eyes blinked, and then a figure emerged from the closet. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its skin pale and almost translucent. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it wasn't used to walking. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. The figure stepped closer, its eyes never leaving mine, and I could see its mouth twist into a grotesque smile. Just as it reached the foot of my bed, the sound of a car horn blared outside, snapping me out of my trance. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The closet door was closed, and the room was silent once more. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of sleep paralysis? But the fear felt too real, too visceral to be just a dream. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in bed, clutching my phone, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I called Sarah and told her what had happened. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she told me to come stay with her at her parents' house. I didn't argue. I packed a bag and left the house, locking the door behind me. I never found out what that thing was or where it came from. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a nightmare or a trick of the light, but deep down, I know it was real. And every time I'm alone in that house, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, waiting in the darkness, watching me with those glowing eyes. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The party had been lively, filled with laughter, music, and the kind of conversations that only happen in the wee hours of the morning. My friends and I had stayed out far later than we intended, and by the time I finally decided to head home, the streets were empty, bathed in the eerie glow of flickering streetlights. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the silence was almost deafening. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how quiet the world could be when everyone else was asleep. I fumbled with my keys as I approached my front door, my fingers numb from the cold. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and uninviting. I had left a single light on in the living room, but it did little to dispel the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as I stepped inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. I kicked off my shoes and dropped my bag by the door, too tired to care about tidying up. The house felt different somehow, colder, emptier than usual. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the late hour and my exhaustion. I made my way to the kitchen, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The fridge hummed softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent house. I grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the backyard. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I finished my water and headed upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, and I could already feel the pull of my bed, promising warmth and comfort. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There was a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from my room. It was a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a window. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood there, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the glass. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it, and I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. I pushed the door open slowly, peering into the room. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal, untouched. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. The window was closed, the curtains still. There was no sign of anyone or anything. I let out a shaky laugh, chiding myself for being so jumpy. I was tired, that was all. My imagination was running wild. I closed the door behind me and began to get ready for bed, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. But as I pulled back the covers, I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My blood ran cold, and I turned slowly toward the window. The curtains were moving, just slightly, as if something had brushed against them. I approached the window cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out and pulled the curtains aside, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty backyard, bathed in moonlight. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and closed the curtains, making sure they were securely in place. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The room was quiet now, the tapping gone. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of the curtains, the distant hoot of an owl. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control, and then I heard it. A voice, soft and barely audible, whispering my name. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. I sat up, my heart pounding, and stared into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of my dresser and the mirror above it. But the voice came again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the corner, it was coming from the mirror. I felt a chill run down my spine as I slowly got out of bed and approached the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. But as I watched, something changed. My reflection smiled, a slow, sinister smile that didn't match the fear on my face. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and I heard the voice again, louder now, more urgent. "Let me out," it said, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't my voice. It was someone else's, someone who sounded eerily familiar, but who I couldn't quite place. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The reflection's smile widened, and I saw its eyes, dark, empty, and filled with a malice that made my stomach churn. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually I managed to tear my eyes away and stumble out of the room. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial the number. I called my best friend, the one who had been at the party with me, and begged her to come over. She sounded confused but agreed, and I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, waiting for her to arrive. The house was silent again, but the silence was worse now, heavy and oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, waiting. When my friend finally arrived, I practically dragged her inside, babbling about the mirror and the voice and the reflection that wasn't mine. She looked at me like I was crazy, but she humored me, following me upstairs to my room. The mirror was just a mirror again, my reflection normal and unremarkable. My friend laughed nervously, telling me I must have been more tired than I thought. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We stayed up the rest of the night, talking and watching movies, and by the time the sun rose, I had almost convinced myself it had all been a dream. But as I walked my friend to the door, I glanced back at the mirror in the hallway. For just a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. I blinked, and it was gone. My friend waved goodbye, and I closed the door, leaning against it with a sigh. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt comforting. It felt like it was waiting, biding its time. I never told anyone else about that night, but I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror for weeks. Even now, years later, I still feel a chill whenever I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye. I tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed and seeing things. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was in the mirror that night, something that wanted out, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, waiting for the right moment to try again. The rain had been falling for hours, a relentless downpour that turned the narrow jungle road into a slippery, treacherous path. My car's headlights barely cut through the thick curtain of water, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up. I was miles from the nearest town, and the GPS had lost signal over an hour ago. The map on my phone was useless now, just a spinning circle where my location should have been. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white as the tires skidded on the muddy road. The jungle loomed on either side of me, dense and impenetrable, the trees swaying ominously in the storm, and then it happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Just like that, I turned the key, but nothing happened, not even a click. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The rain continued to hammer down, the sound deafening against the roof of the car. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't stay here. The road was too isolated, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal, no way to call for help. I peered through the rain-streaked window, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw it, a faint light in the distance. It was faint, almost like a flicker, but it was there. A house. It had to be. I didn't have many options. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my phone and a few essentials inside, and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked me instantly, the cold water dripping down my neck and back. I slung the backpack over my shoulders and started walking toward the light. The road was slick with mud, and I slipped more than once, my hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. The jungle seemed to close in around me, the trees creaking and groaning in the wind. Every shadow felt alive, every sound made my heart race. But I kept moving, my eyes fixed on that faint light. It took me what felt like an eternity to reach it, but finally, I saw the outline of a house. It was old, weathered, with a sagging roof and peeling paint. The light came from a single window on the ground floor, the glow spilling out into the rain-soaked night. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the property. The house looked abandoned, but the light suggested otherwise. I took a deep breath and approached the front door. It was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I knocked, the sound echoing through the empty space. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved further into the house. The light I had seen came from a single oil lamp sitting on a dusty table in the center of the room. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture was old and covered in sheets, giving the room an eerie, ghostly appearance. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello, is anyone here?" Silence. I set my backpack down and took a closer look around. The house was small, just a single floor with a few rooms. The kitchen was to my left, the counters covered in a thick layer of dust. A hallway led to what I assumed were bedrooms. I decided to stay in the main room, near the lamp. I didn't want to venture too far into the house. Not yet. I found an old moth-eaten blanket draped over a chair and wrapped it around myself. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound almost soothing now that I was out of it. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and tried to calm my nerves. The storm would pass, I told myself. I would wait it out, and in the morning, I would figure out what to do. But as the hours dragged on, I began to notice things, small things at first. The way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The faint sound of footsteps upstairs, even though I was sure the house was empty. The way the lamp's flame would flicker, as if someone or something was breathing on it. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of exhaustion and fear. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Then I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like fingers drumming against wood. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, and grabbed the lamp. The light wavered as I moved, casting strange shapes on the walls. I stepped toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping stopped. I stood there, holding the lamp, staring into the darkness. The hallway was empty, but I could feel something there, just beyond the edge of the light. I took a step forward, and the floorboard beneath me creaked loudly. The sound seemed to echo through the house, and for a moment, everything was still. Then from the darkness, I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. A single word, repeated over and over. "Stay." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lamp. The whisper grew louder, more voices joining in, until it felt like the entire house was alive, urging me to stay. I turned and ran, grabbing my backpack as I bolted for the door. The rain hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, but I didn't care. I ran down the muddy road, the light from the house growing smaller and smaller behind me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself back at my car. The storm had begun to ease, the rain slowing to a drizzle. I climbed inside, locking the doors behind me, and sat there, shivering and soaked. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, felt the presence of that house. When morning came, the storm had passed. The jungle was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, the sunlight filtering through the trees. I tried to start the car, and to my surprise, the engine turned over. I didn't question it. I just drove, leaving that house, and whatever was inside it, far behind. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain is falling and the wind is howling, I think about that house, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it, waiting for them to stay. The house was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The real estate agent had called it cozy and full of charm, but as I stood there, key in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, something earthy, like wet leaves or freshly turned soil. I dropped my bags by the door and stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the hardwood floors. The living room was small but inviting, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall and a large window that looked out into the woods. The furniture was old but sturdy, the kind of pieces that had been passed down through generations. A worn armchair sat by the fireplace, its fabric frayed but still comfortable looking. I ran my hand along the back of the chair, feeling the rough texture under my fingers, and for a moment I could almost imagine someone sitting there, staring into the flames. I shook the thought away and turned my attention to the rest of the house. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old-fashioned stove and a sink that looked like it had seen better days. The cabinets were filled with mismatched dishes and glasses, and the refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. I opened it, half expecting to find something strange inside, but it was empty, except for a single bottle of water and a note from the real estate agent wishing me a pleasant stay. The bedroom was at the end of a short hallway, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my eyes immediately drawn to the large four-poster bed that dominated the room. The bed was made up with crisp white sheets and a thick quilt, and a pair of slippers had been placed neatly at the foot of the bed. It was a thoughtful touch, but it made me uneasy. It felt like someone had been here recently, preparing the room for me. I set my suitcase down and began unpacking, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The house was old, I reminded myself. It was normal for old houses to have quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, the occasional strange smell. But as I hung my clothes in the closet, I couldn't help but notice how the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time I finished unpacking, it was fully dark outside. I made my way back to the kitchen and rummaged through the cabinets, looking for something to eat. I found a box of pasta and a jar of sauce, and though it wasn't much, it was enough to make a simple dinner. As I waited for the water to boil, I couldn't help but glance out the window. The woods were pitch black, the trees swaying gently in the wind. It was peaceful, but there was something about the way the shadows moved that made me uneasy. I ate my dinner at the small table in the kitchen, the sound of the wind outside the only noise breaking the silence. When I was finished, I washed the dishes and made my way to the living room, where I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, casting a warm glow throughout the room, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a sense of calm. I settled into the armchair by the fire, a book in my lap, and let myself relax. The house was quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. It was peaceful, and for a while, I forgot about the strange feeling I had when I first arrived. But as the night wore on, the feeling returned. It started as a faint sensation, like the prickling of hairs on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book in my hands, but the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. I looked up from my book, my eyes scanning the room. The fire had died down to embers, casting the room in a dim, flickering light. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and move, as if they were alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of being alone in an unfamiliar place. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker, and the silence more oppressive. I set my book down and stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was quiet, but the silence felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. I walked to the window and looked out into the woods. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a figure, tall and thin, standing among the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped away from the window, my heart racing. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the shadows playing tricks on me, but as I turned back to the room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, moving across the wall. It was tall and thin, with long spindly limbs that twisted and bent in unnatural ways. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it were aware of me, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The shadow stopped, hovering just a few feet away from me. I could feel its presence, a cold, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me, suffocating me, and then, slowly, it began to move again. This time towards me. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, my body paralyzed with fear. The shadow loomed over me, its form shifting and twisting, as if it were made of smoke. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, a chill that seeped into my bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The shadow dissipated, melting into the darkness, leaving me standing alone in the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. It felt like an eternity, but it could have only been a few seconds. Finally, I managed to move, my legs trembling as I stumbled back to the couch. I sat down, pulling the blanket tightly around me, trying to calm my racing heart. But even as I sat there, staring into the fire, I knew that I wasn't alone. The shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The house had something in store for me, something far more terrifying than I could ever imagine. And I was trapped here, alone, with no way to escape. The fire had nearly died out by the time I gathered the courage to move again. The embers glowed faintly, casting a soft orange light that barely reached the corners of the room. I sat there, for what felt like hours, wrapped in the blanket, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The house was silent, but the silence itself felt alive, as if it were listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my fear, I couldn't fight the pull of sleep any longer. I dragged myself to the bedroom, the floorboards creaking under my weight with every step. The door to the bedroom was still slightly ajar, just as I had left it. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my eyes immediately drawn to the bed. The quilt was still neatly folded, the slippers still waiting at the foot of the bed. It felt too inviting, too perfect, as if someone had prepared it just for me. I hesitated for a moment before climbing into bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin. The sheets were cold, and the pillows smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that should have been comforting, but instead felt out of place, like it didn't belong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind outside. It whistled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the house. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the window. My eyes snapped open, and I turned my head toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the window, the moonlight filtering through the fabric. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up, clutching the quilt to my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of the wind and the tapping, which had now grown into a steady, deliberate rhythm. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet sinking into the plush carpet. The tapping continued, each knock sending a jolt of fear through me. I walked to the window, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. I hesitated for a moment, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, before pulling the curtain aside. There was nothing there. The window looked out into the woods, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The moonlight cast long, twisting shadows on the ground, but there was no one there, no sign of what could have been making the noise. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, before letting the curtain fall back into place. The tapping stopped. I turned away from the window, my heart still racing, and climbed back into bed. I pulled the quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the branches of a tree tapping against the window. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound had been too deliberate, too intentional. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The house seemed to groan and shift around me, as if it were alive, breathing. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. Finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun was shining through the curtains, casting a warm golden light throughout the room. For a moment I allowed myself to believe that the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as I sat up, the memories came flooding back, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. The kitchen was just as I had left it, the dishes still drying in the rack by the sink. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, the sound of the gas igniting a small comfort in the otherwise silent house. As I waited for the water to boil, I couldn't help but glance out the window. The woods were peaceful in the daylight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago they had seemed so menacing, so alive. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the small table in the kitchen, sipping it slowly as I tried to gather my thoughts. The house was quiet, but the silence felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, more comforting. I told myself that I had been spooked by the unfamiliar surroundings, that the tapping had just been the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I spent the rest of the morning exploring the house, trying to distract myself from the lingering sense of unease. The house was small, but it was filled with little details that I hadn't noticed before. A faded photograph of a family hanging on the wall, a collection of old books on a shelf in the living room, a dusty music box on the mantel above the fireplace. I picked up the music box and turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It was old, the wood worn smooth with age, and the metal key was rusted. I turned the key, and the music box began to play a soft, haunting melody. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. But as the melody played on, I noticed something strange. The music box was playing a tune that I recognized, a lullaby that my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child. It was a song that I hadn't heard in years, and hearing it now, in this strange, unfamiliar house, sent a chill down my spine. I set the music box down and stepped away from the mantel, my heart pounding in my chest. The melody continued to play, the notes lingering in the air like a ghostly whisper. I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of the music box fading behind me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning the house and organizing my things, but the sense of unease never fully left me. As the sun began to set, I found myself drawn back to the living room, where the fire was still burning faintly in the fireplace. I sat down in the armchair and stared into the flames, my mind racing with thoughts of the previous night. The tapping, the shadow, the music box, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle that I couldn't quite put together. I told myself that I was overthinking it, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew that there was something in this house, something that didn't want me here. As the night deepened, the feeling grew stronger. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and move, and the air grew colder, heavier. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill, but it was no use. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, a deep, unshakable chill that no amount of warmth could dispel. And then I heard it again. The tapping, it was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but as I listened, it grew louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I wanted to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too intentional. I stood up and walked to the window, my legs trembling with every step. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the window, the moonlight filtering through the fabric. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. I reached for the curtain, my hand trembling as I pulled it aside. There was nothing there. The window looked out into the woods, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The moonlight cast long, twisting shadows on the ground, but there was no one there, no sign of what could have been making the noise. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, before letting the curtain fall back into place. The tapping stopped. I turned away from the window, my heart still racing, and walked back to the armchair. I sat down and pulled the blanket tightly around me, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The house had something in store for me, something far more terrifying than I could ever imagine. And I was trapped here, alone, with no way to escape.